In Los Angeles, beneath the blinding lights of the Dolby Theater, a man of laughter and faith was about to face a legend forged in silence and discipline. What began as a charity broadcast meant to heal turned volatile when one man's conviction collided with another's disbelief. Steve Harvey wasn't your typical television host. For decades, he'd been America's preacher in a suit, known for turning pain into parables and comedy into gospel. When Chuck Norris dismissed Jesus as a story people outgrow, he had no idea he was lighting a match near the heart of a man who lived by the word. Steve's eruption on live television, a moment of pure, unfiltered fury, would unleash a national reckoning on faith, pride, and the cost of defending belief in a world built on spectacle. What began as a night of unity and hope would become a crisis of identity broadcast to millions. The Dolby Theater, once a stage for legends, would become the altar where one man's devotion met its breaking point. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Dolby Theater pulsed with electric anticipation. Every seat filled, every light blazing, every camera angled to capture what promised to be the fundraising event of the year. Legends of Strength glowed in massive gold letters across the stage, while screens throughout the venue displayed the running tally of donations already surpassing $8 million for children's hospitals nationwide. Backstage, Steve Harvey adjusted his immaculate suit jacket, the deep burgundy fabric catching the light as he checked his reflection one last time. He rolled his shoulders back, closed his eyes, and whispered the same prayer he'd said before every show for 30 years. Lord, use me tonight. Let your light shine through me. Maya Torres, clipboard clutched to her chest, appeared in the doorway. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and the headset wrapped around her ear crackled with the controlled chaos of pre-show communications. 5 minutes, Steve, she said, her voice calm despite the frenetic energy buzzing around them. Chuck just arrived. He's in makeup now. Steve nodded, his expression brightening. How's he seem? Quiet. Focused. Maya hesitated, then added, different than I expected. That's Chuck. Steve chuckled. Man of few words until he's got something worth saying. He straightened his tie with practiced precision. The segment's gonna be gold, Maya. 2 different kinds of strength coming together: his discipline, my faith. People need to hear this tonight. Maya smiled tightly. As the show's executive producer, she'd fought for this pairing, convinced the network it would deliver both ratings and substance. But something in the air felt off. Maybe it was the way Chuck had barely acknowledged her greeting, or how the charity's director had whispered about keeping things light 3 separate times. Remember, it's a fundraiser first, she said, tapping her clipboard. We're at 8 million, but we need to hit 12 before the final hour. The hospital wing doesn't build itself. Steve's laugh filled the room. Maya, relax. The Lord brought us here for a purpose. Chuck Norris and Steve Harvey talking strength and resilience while raising money for sick kids? That's a blessing wrapped in entertainment. Served with a side of inspiration. He winked. And you know I always deliver. The stage manager appeared behind Maya. 30 seconds. Mr. Harvey. Steve nodded, his expression shifting from casual to focused in an instant. He rolled his neck, took a deep breath, and transformed before Maya's eyes into the magnetic presence millions welcomed into their homes daily. Let's do this, he said, striding past her toward the stage. Maya watched him go, the uneasiness lingering. In the control room monitors, she could see the audience executives in tailored suits, celebrities in designer dresses, ordinary people who'd paid thousands for charity seats, all buzzing with energy. The camera panned across their expectant faces before cutting to a shot of Chuck Norris, waiting in the wings, his expression unreadable. posture perfect even at 77. The legendary martial artist seemed carved from stone, his eyes fixed on some distant point. The house lights dimmed, and the crowd's murmur rose to a roar as Steve Harvey burst onto the stage, arms wide, smile wider. Los Angeles. His voice boomed through the theater, confident and warm. Are you ready to change some lives tonight? The audience erupted. Camera flashes peppered the darkness like stars. Steve moved across the stage with the ease of a man who'd made a career of owning every room he entered. Now, I'm gonna be straight with y'all, he said, pacing casually as the cheers subsided. We're here for the children tonight. Every dollar, every penny, going to build new wings at children's hospitals across this country. He paused, his expression growing serious. I've visited those hospitals, seen those kids fighting battles no child should have to fight. And let me tell you something. His voice dropped to an intimate register that somehow reached every corner of the massive theater. Those children know more about true strength than most adults ever will. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. A woman in the front row dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Which is why tonight isn't just about opening wallets, though we definitely want you doing that too. Laughter followed, breaking the tension. Tonight is about exploring what real strength looks like. Not just physical power, but spiritual fortitude. Not just outer toughness, but inner resilience. Steve moved to center stage, his voice taking on the rhythm and cadence that had made his motivational speaking as renowned as his comedy. In my life I've known dark times. Been homeless. Been broken. Been lost. But I'm standing here today because faith lifted me up when my own strength failed. God's grace, not my hustle, not my talent, that's what transformed Steve Harvey from a man sleeping in his car to a man standing on this stage. The audience applauded, several people rising to their feet. Maya watched from the control booth, fingers hovering over buttons, eyes flicking between monitors. This was Steve at his best, vulnerable, authentic, walking that perfect line between preacher and entertainer. But tonight, Steve continued, we're blessed to have another kind of strength joining us on this stage. A man who's dedicated his life to discipline, excellence, and mastery. A legend who's shown the world what happens when you commit fully to perfecting your craft. The audience began to stir with anticipation. Camera operators adjusted their angles. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome a true American icon, a man whose name has become synonymous with unstoppable force. Mr. Chuck Norris. The crowd erupted as spotlights swiveled toward stage left. The iconic theme from Walker, Texas Ranger filled the theater as Chuck Norris strode out, his movements deliberate and controlled, not a hint of the stiffness one might expect from a man his age. He wore a simple black suit, no tie, his bearing military straight. His weathered face bore the slight hint of a smile, not the broad grin of a entertainer, but the measured acknowledgement of a warrior. Steve met him center stage, arms outstretched. They embraced briefly. A contrast of styles, Steve's ebullient energy against Chuck's stoic reserve. The man, the myth, the legend, Steve announced as they separated. Chuck Norris. Ladies and gentlemen, the internet says when he does push-ups, he's not pushing himself up, he's pushing the earth down. Laughter and applause filled the theater. Chuck's smile widened just slightly as he took a seat in one of two leather chairs positioned center stage. Steve sat opposite him, leaning forward with the eager body language of a born interviewer. Now Chuck, before we dive in, I gotta ask, of all the Chuck Norris facts floating around, which one's your favorite? Chuck chuckled. The sound surprisingly warm coming from such a composed figure. Probably that I counted to infinity, twice. The audience laughed appreciatively. Steve slapped his knee, his face lighting up. See? That's what people don't know about you. The man's got humor. Steve settled more comfortably into his chair. But seriously, we're here tonight talking about strength. And few people on this planet have become more synonymous with that concept than you. 6-time karate world champion, actor, author. You've built an entire legacy around discipline and power. What does strength mean to you, Chuck? Chuck leaned forward slightly, his eyes focused with the intensity that had made him a screen icon. 1. Strength isn't about how hard you can hit, he said, his voice measured and firm. It's about mastery over yourself, your emotions, your limitations. True power comes from within, not from external validation or luck. Steve nodded enthusiastically. That's deep. Self-mastery. I love that. He turned slightly toward the audience. You know, that connects beautifully with faith too. The Bible tells us to take every thought captive. There's a spiritual discipline there that parallels the physical discipline you're talking about. Something flickered across Chuck's expression. Subtle, but unmistakable to those watching closely. A slight cooling, a narrowing of the eyes. I've always believed the only higher power worth trusting is the one within yourself, Chuck replied, his tone still conversational, but carrying a new edge. All these years, the only thing I've seen consistently show up is human will and determination, not divine intervention. A ripple of unease moved through the audience. Steve's smile remained fixed, but those who knew him well could see the momentary confusion in his eyes, the mental recalibration of a conversation suddenly veering off script. In the control room, Maya straightened, her attention sharpening. Stay wide on both of them. She instructed the camera operators through her headset. Capture reactions. Steve laughed, but it didn't reach his eyes. Well, I guess that's where our journeys differ, my friend. Because in my experience, human will runs out, and when it does, faith is what catches you. Does it? Chuck's question hung in the air. Deceptively simple. Steve blinked, his famous quick wit momentarily stalled. It has for me. Every time. Or maybe, Chuck said, leaning back in his chair. You're a remarkably talented man who found inner strength and attributed it to something outside yourself. Sometimes it's harder to acknowledge our own power than to credit a higher source. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Maya watched Steve's face on the monitor, recognizing the warning signs, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his smile became more deliberate. She'd produced his shows for years. She knew when the famously composed host was being rattled. Let's go to break, she said into her headset. But the program director shook his head. Ratings are spiking. Keep rolling. Steve adjusted his position, the movement buying him a moment to gather himself. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cadence of testimony, a rhythm honed in churches long before television studios. You know, Chuck, I respect your journey and your philosophy. Truly, I do. But I've walked through valleys where no amount of self-determination could have saved me. My faith isn't a crutch or an excuse, it's the very foundation that makes everything else possible. Chuck nodded politely, but his eyes held challenge. I understand that's your perspective, Steve, and it works for you. But I've traveled the world, studied with masters across every spiritual tradition, and what I've found is that these systems of belief, he gestured vaguely, they're all constructs. Useful for some, perhaps, but ultimately limiting. Someone in the audience gasped audibly. The cameras caught Steve's expression shifting, the consummate professional battling with the deeply devout believer. Limiting? Steve repeated, the single word carrying weight. Chuck shrugged, apparently unaware of the emotional landmine he'd just stepped on. Religion packages universal truths in mythology. It adds layers that distance people from their own innate power. Why pray for strength when you can develop it? Why credit God for your success when you put in the work? In the control booth, Maya's stomach dropped. She'd researched Chuck extensively, knew he'd expressed spiritual views in past interviews, but nothing that directly challenged religious faith. Had they missed something, or was Chuck simply speaking more candidly than usual? Cut to commercial. She ordered again, more urgently. Negative, came the response from the network executive standing behind her. This is television gold. On stage, Steve's smile had vanished entirely. The audience sat in uncomfortable silence, watching the invisible line being crossed in real time. "Chuck," Steve said, his voice quieter now, intensity building beneath the surface. "Are you saying faith is a weakness?" Chuck met his gaze directly. "I'm saying it can be a beautiful fiction that keeps people from recognizing their true capabilities. Like training wheels on a bicycle, helpful for some, but ultimately something to outgrow." The metaphor hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. For Steve Harvey, the man who credited God openly for every success, who began each show with prayer, who saw his platform as ministry, there could have been few comparisons more directly challenging. Maya watched helplessly as Steve's hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles whitening. "Faith has built hospitals," Steve said, his voice tightly controlled. "Faith has fed the hungry, clothed the naked, given hope to the hopeless. Faith has transformed lives, including mine." "People did those things," Chuck countered calmly. "Good people taking action. The belief system is secondary to the human will driving it." The audience had gone completely still, sensing the tension crackling between the two legends. Camera operators exchanged nervous glances but kept their lenses trained on the unfolding drama. Steve took a deep breath, visibly working to maintain his composure. "We'll have to agree to disagree on that one, Chuck. But I appreciate your candor." He forced a smile, attempting to steer back to safer ground. "Let's talk about your charitable work with—" "That's the problem with faith discussions," Chuck interrupted, seemingly oblivious to the tension he'd created. "They end when challenged, rather than beginning. No offense intended, Steve. But if your God is real, shouldn't your faith be strong enough to withstand questions?" The sound of Maya's sharp intake of breath was audible through her microphone to the production crew. On stage, Steve's expression shifted, confusion giving way to something darker. For a man accustomed to controlling conversations, to shaping narratives with his charisma and wit, being cornered in front of millions felt like a public ambush. "My faith," Steve said slowly, each word deliberate, "is not on trial here tonight, Chuck." Chuck nodded, but then added, "None of our beliefs should be above examination." "That's my point." The camera caught it all, the flicker of Steve's eyelid, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the momentary darkness that passed across his usually jovial features. Something was building beneath the surface, a pressure looking for release. Maya's finger hovered over the button that would force a commercial break regardless of the director's wishes. The charity event was devolving before her eyes, and no amount of donation dollars was worth the brewing storm she could see gathering in Steve Harvey's expression. In the audience, a woman whispered to her companion just loudly enough to be picked up by the sensitive microphones. "I thought they were friends." Steve heard it. Something in that simple statement, the disappointment, the confusion, seemed to pierce through his rising anger. He closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. "You know what, Chuck?" he said, his voice finding its rhythm again. "We came here tonight to talk about different kinds of strength, and maybe this right here is the perfect example." He gestured between them. Two men with different perspectives, different journeys, different truths, but both trying to lift people up in our own ways. It was a masterful pivot, a professional's attempt to salvage the segment. The audience responded with relieved applause, grateful for the tension break. Chuck nodded appreciatively, seeming to recognize the olive branch. "Well said, Steve." But as the applause faded, he added, almost casually, "Though I've always found it interesting how often religious folks need their particular version of truth protected from scrutiny. If something's truly divine, shouldn't it stand on its own?" The words landed like a slap. Steve's expression froze, the reconciliatory moment shattered. "I've given God the glory for 30 years on television, Chuck," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Never once hiding my faith or apologizing for it." "That doesn't sound like someone afraid of scrutiny." Chuck shrugged. "I wasn't speaking about you specifically, Steve. Just an observation." But it was too late. The damage was done. On millions of screens across America, viewers watched as Steve Harvey, the consummate professional, the man famous for his cool under pressure, visibly struggled to contain himself. His breathing had changed, his posture tightened, his eyes narrowed. In the control booth, Maya made an executive decision. Break. Now. She slammed her hand on the button before anyone could countermand her. The Legends of Strength logo appeared on screens nationwide as the broadcast cut to commercial, but in the Dolby Theater, there were no commercials to hide behind. No reprieve from the tension that had built to breaking point. The audience watched, cameras still rolling for later use, as Steve Harvey rose slowly from his chair, microphone still clipped to his lapel, broadcasting his every word to the production team if not to the world. 30 years in entertainment," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "And I have never been disrespected like this on my own stage." Chuck looked genuinely surprised. "Steve, I meant no disrespect. I was just sharing my perspective." "Your perspective?" Steve repeated, his voice rising. "Your perspective calls my entire life's foundation a convenient fiction. A child's crutch to be outgrown." His hands were shaking now, a vein pulsing visibly in his temple. "Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Chuck stood too, his movements fluid despite his age. "I think you're taking this too personally." "Too personally?" Steve stepped closer. "My faith isn't a suit I put on for television, Chuck. It's who I am. It's how I survived. It's why I'm standing here." The audience sat frozen, witnessing something raw and unscripted on a stage known for polish and preparation. Maya was already moving from the control booth, trying to reach the stage before whatever was building reached its flashpoint. Chuck raised his hands in a placating gesture, but his expression remained unmoved. "Steve, everyone has the right to their beliefs. I'm just suggesting that maybe, just maybe, what you attribute to God is really your own inner strength all along." Steve shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping. "The pride of man, thinking he did it all himself." He looked toward the ceiling, then back at Chuck. "You know what your problem is? You've convinced yourself you don't need anything bigger than Chuck Norris. And you've convinced yourself you can't stand without a supernatural crutch." Chuck replied, his patience visibly thinning. "We're going in circles, Steve." The audience collectively held its breath. On stage, two icons stood facing each other, one trembling with barely contained emotion, the other impassive and unmoved. The contrast could not have been starker. Passion versus stoicism. Faith versus self-reliance. Fire versus ice. Maya had almost reached the stage when Chuck, perhaps attempting to end the exchange with something light, made his final mistake. "Look," he said, his tone softening slightly. "We're here for charity tonight. Let's focus on that. The kids don't care if God is real or if Jesus is coming back to save us from ourselves." And with that casual dismissal, with that one careless reference, Something in Steve Harvey, the composed host, the professional entertainer, the man who had built an empire on controlled charisma, finally broke. The crowd gasped as Steve lunged forward. Jesus isn't coming back to save us from ourselves. Chuck Norris's words seemed to hang suspended in the charged air of the theater. Electric and dangerous. For a split second, time stood still. The audience froze, cameras zoomed in, and Maya Torres halted mid-stride at the edge of the stage, horrified recognition blooming across her face. She had seen that look in Steve Harvey's eyes only once before 5 years earlier, when a drunk heckler had made a crude joke about Steve's daughters during a charity event in Chicago. Then, everything accelerated. Steve's body moved before his mind could stop it. 2 quick steps forward. Hands outstretched. He shoved Chuck Norris hard in the chest. The force sent the martial arts legend stumbling backward, surprise flashing across his stoic features as he caught himself just short of falling. The audience erupted in gasps and shouts. Phones rose in unison, capturing what no one had ever seen: Steve Harvey, America's moral compass and comedy icon, physically lashing out on live television. "Don't you dare!" Steve's voice boomed across the theater, raw emotion stripping away decades of broadcast polish. "Don't you dare mock my savior!" Security guards rushed from the wings, but hesitated at the edge of the stage, uncertain how to handle 2 celebrities of this caliber. The charity's director appeared beside Maya, his face ashen. "Stop this. Now." Chuck straightened, adjusting his jacket with deliberate slowness. His expression hadn't changed, the same controlled calm that had made him a legend, but his eyes had hardened to flints. When he spoke, his voice was quiet yet carried throughout the suddenly silent theater. "Is this your Christian witness, Steve? Putting hands on someone for speaking their truth?" The words hit harder than the shove. Steve flinched as though struck, his rage momentarily giving way to confusion, then horror. He looked down at his outstretched hands as if they belonged to someone else, as if he couldn't believe what they had just done. In the control room, technicians sat frozen at their stations. The program director's voice cut through their headsets. "We're still off air for 90 more seconds. Someone get down there and separate them." But Maya was already on it, stepping between the 2 men with the authority of someone who had managed celebrity egos for decades. "Enough," she said, her voice pitched low but commanding. "Both of you, step back. Now." Steve's chest heaved with ragged breaths. The magnitude of his actions was beginning to register on his face, shock mixing with shame. Anger, giving way to disbelief. Chuck remained motionless, watching Steve with the calculating gaze of someone who had spent a lifetime reading opponents. "I'm sorry," Steve finally managed, the words sounding inadequate even to his own ears. "I shouldn't have, that was—" He struggled to find the right words, sweat beading on his forehead beneath the hot stage lights. Chuck gave a single measured nod. "No, you shouldn't have." He turned to Maya. "I think it's best if I leave now." "No, wait," Steve said, reaching out again before catching himself and withdrawing his hand. "Chuck, please. That was unacceptable. When you said that about Jesus." 70 seconds to air crackled through Maya's earpiece. She made a split-second decision. "Steve, go backstage. Now." "Chuck, please give us a moment to sort this out." Security had finally moved onto the stage, creating a subtle barrier between the 2 celebrities. The audience remained riveted, hundreds of phones still recording every moment of the unfolding drama. In the front row, Reverend Cole, Steve's longtime spiritual mentor, who had been invited as a special guest, stood with his hand over his heart. His expression pained as he watched his friend unraveling. "I can't just walk off," Steve protested. "The fundraiser, the children, is exactly why you need to step away right now." Maya finished firmly. We have other segments prepared. I'll handle it. Conflict played across Steve's face, the professional in him battling the wounded believer. Finally, with a nod that looked physically painful, he turned and walked off stage, shoulders hunched in a posture so unlike his usual confident stride that audible murmurs of concern spread through the audience. Chuck watched him go, then turned to Maya. I think my participation in tonight's event is over. His voice was calm, but final. Chuck, please. Maya lowered her voice so only he could hear. Steve was wrong to put his hands on you, no question. But I've never seen him like this. What you said about Jesus was my honest opinion. Chuck finished. I didn't come here to pretend to be something I'm not. Maya. I came to support the charity and have a conversation about different philosophies of strength. He glanced toward where Steve had disappeared backstage. I didn't expect a physical confrontation for challenging religious beliefs. 30 seconds. The voice in Maya's earpiece warned. She made a desperate calculation. Can you at least stay until the commercial break ends? Let me announce you've had to leave early. Otherwise, it looks like what just happened, Chuck stated flatly. A religious man losing control when his faith was questioned. He considered for a moment, then nodded. Fine. 1 more minute, for the children's charity. Then I'm gone. Maya sagged with relief. Thank you. She gestured to the stage manager. Bring me a microphone. Now! As the commercial break ended, viewers across America returned to find not the scheduled conversation between two legends, but Maya Torres standing center stage, poised and professional despite the chaos that had erupted moments before. Welcome back to Legends of Strength, she began smoothly. We want to thank Chuck Norris for joining us tonight and for his generous contribution to our fundraising efforts. She gestured to Chuck, who nodded stoically to the audience. Camera operators, instructed through their headsets, kept their shots tight, avoiding the visible tension in the room. In living rooms across America, the transition seemed almost normal. A simple schedule change, rather than the aftermath of a physical altercation. Chuck has another commitment this evening and needs to leave a bit earlier than planned, Maya continued, the practiced lie sliding easily from her lips. So, please join me in thanking him for being here tonight. The audience, still shocked, offered scattered applause. Chuck raised a hand in acknowledgement, then walked off stage with the same measured dignity that had defined his career, his expression betraying nothing of the confrontation that had just occurred. Coming up next, Maya continued without missing a beat. Musical sensation Greenlight will perform their latest hit, followed by our special tribute to the brave children fighting at St. Jude's Hospital. But first, let's take a moment to hear from our sponsors. As the broadcast cut to commercial again, Maya's professional smile dropped. She handed the microphone to a waiting technician and rushed backstage, following the path Steve had taken moments earlier. Behind her, she could hear the audience erupting into frantic conversations, the collective shock finding voice now that the cameras were off. Backstage was controlled chaos. Staff members huddled in corners, whispering urgently. Network executives shouted into phones. In the green room doorway, Maya found Reverend Cole speaking quietly with the charity's director, both men wearing expressions of grave concern. Where is he? She asked without preamble. Reverend Cole pointed toward Steve's dressing room. In there. Won't open the door. And Chuck? Already left through the back exit, the charity director replied, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. No statement. No comment to press. Just gone. Maya closed her eyes briefly, calculating the damage. How bad is it out there? The director held up his phone, screen facing her. Twitter was exploding with hashtags. Number, Steve vs. Chuck. Number, Faith Fight. Number, Legends Meltdown. Video clips were already circulating shaky phone footage from audience members showing Steve pushing Chuck, their confrontation playing out in viral snippets. "It's everywhere," he said grimly. "Every major news outlet will have this within the hour." Maya nodded, unsurprised, but still dismayed. "I need to talk to him." "He won't listen to any of us," the director warned. "He's Maya. I've never seen him like this. It's like he's in shock." "I've known Steve for 15 years, she replied, already moving toward the dressing room. "Let me try." She knocked firmly on the door. "Steve, it's Maya. I'm coming in." Without waiting for a response, she tried the handle locked. "Steve, open the door. Now." Silence. "Stephen Harvey," she said, using his full name as she had only once before the night his father died. "Open this door, or I swear I will have security break it down. The show is still going on out there. We have 5 more segments, millions of dollars at stake, and 300 sick children counting on us to finish strong. You do not get to hide in there." A moment passed. Then another. Finally, the lock clicked. Maya pushed the door open to find Steve sitting motionless in front of the dressing room mirror, staring at his reflection as if searching for someone else in the glass. His trademark suit jacket was draped over a chair, his tie loosened, his usual impeccable appearance disheveled. "What have I done?" he whispered, not looking at her. Maya closed the door behind her. For a moment, she said nothing, assessing the man before her. Not the celebrity, not the host, but the human being she had worked alongside for years. She had seen Steve angry, had seen him disappointed, had seen him exhausted. She had never seen him broken. "You put your hands on Chuck Norris on live television," she said finally. Her voice matter-of-fact but not unkind. Or at least, on what would have been live television if I hadn't cut to commercial 3 seconds earlier. Steve's head snapped up. "It didn't air? The shove?" "No. But about 500 audience members recorded it on their phones, so..." She shrugged. "Same difference in 2025. Steve closed his eyes, a shudder running through his body. "I've spent 30 years building a reputation of integrity, Maya. 30 years telling people that faith brings peace, brings control, brings light." His voice cracked. "And then I go and do something like this?" "He provoked you," Maya said softly. Steve shook his head sharply. "No. Don't give me that." Chuck spoke his truth. Bluntly, yes, but honestly. "And his voice caught. "I responded with anger instead of grace, with violence instead of understanding." He looked back at his reflection, disgust evident in his expression. "What kind of witness is that?" Maya moved further into the room, perching on the edge of the makeup counter. "Steve, you're human. Humans make mistakes. Not mistakes like this," he insisted. "Not public mistakes that undermine everything I claim to stand for." He picked up his phone from the counter, glancing at the screen before tossing it aside with a groan. "It's everywhere already, isn't it?" Maya nodded, not bothering to soften the truth. "Trending #1 worldwide." Steve buried his face in his hands. All those children counting on tonight's fundraiser. All that good that was supposed to come from this event. And I let my ego, my pride, my need to defend myself ruin it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Reverend Cole's voice came through. "Steve? May I come in?" Steve looked up, naked fear in his eyes. "I can't face him, Maya." Not right now. You can, and you will, she replied firmly. If there's anyone you need to talk to right now, it's him. She moved to the door and opened it, giving the Reverend a small nod before stepping out to give them privacy. Reverend Cole entered quietly. His tall frame stooped slightly with age, his dark skin contrasting with silver hair, cropped close to his scalp. He had been Steve's spiritual mentor for decades, the man who had guided him through his darkest moments and celebrated his greatest triumphs. "Son," he said simply, his deep voice filling the small room. The single word broke something in Steve. His shoulders began to shake, tears welling in his eyes. "I failed, Reverend. I failed so badly." The older man moved forward, placing a hand on Steve's shoulder. "Yes, you did." The blunt agreement startled Steve enough that he looked up. "You expected me to say you didn't?" Reverend Cole asked, a hint of sad amusement in his tone. "That would be a lie. And neither of us has time for lies right now." He pulled up a chair, sitting directly across from Steve, their knees almost touching. "You lost your temper. You put hands on another man in anger. You let your pride overcome your witness." Steve flinched at each statement, but nodded. "And now," Reverend Cole continued, "you have a choice. You can hide in here, ashamed, letting this moment define you. Or you can walk back out there, humbled but not defeated, and show people what real faith looks like. Not perfect faith, but faith that can acknowledge failure and seek reconciliation." "How?" Steve asked, the word raw and desperate. "How do I face all those people? How do I finish hosting this event, knowing what they just saw me do?" "With the same grace you preach about," Reverend Cole replied simply. "The world doesn't need more perfect Christians, Steve. Lord knows we've had enough of those frauds. The world needs believers who fall down in public and get back up anyway, who show that faith isn't about never making mistakes, it's about how you respond when you do." Steve was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the words. Outside the dressing room, they could hear the muffled sounds of the event continuing, music playing, the audience responding, the machinery of entertainment grinding forward despite the chaos backstage. "Chuck is gone?" he finally asked. Reverend Cole nodded. "Left immediately. No statement. I need to apologize to him. Publicly, privately, whatever it takes." "Yes, you do," the Reverend agreed. "But first, you need to go back out there and finish what you started. There are children counting on tonight's fundraiser, Steve. Your mistake doesn't change that." Steve looked down at his hands, the same hands that had pushed Chuck Norris, in a moment of blind rage. "I don't know if I can face them, Reverend, all those people. All those cameras." "Of course you can," Reverend Cole said firmly. "Because you're not going out there as perfect Steve Harvey, master of ceremonies. You're going out there as a flawed man who just showed the world exactly how human he is." He leaned forward, catching Steve's gaze and holding it. "Your credibility as a polished entertainer might be damaged, son. But your authenticity as a believer, who struggles just like everyone else, that's never been stronger." The words seemed to reach something deep in Steve. He sat straighter, wiping roughly at his eyes. "I've spent my whole career being in control," Steve said softly, "being the voice of reason, the moral compass. What happens when the world sees that's not always true? Then the world sees something real," Reverend Cole replied. "Something honest. And maybe, just maybe, that honesty reaches more people than your polished perfection ever did." Steve took a deep breath, smoothed his tie, and reached for his jacket. "I need 5 minutes to get myself together. Then I'll come back out." Reverend Cole nodded, patting Steve's shoulder as he stood. "I'll be praying for you, son. Not for your image or your career, for your peace. After the Reverend left, Steve remained seated, staring at his reflection. The face, looking back at him, seemed somehow different, the same features but with the mask of confidence stripped away, revealing the vulnerability beneath. His phone buzzed again on the counter. Another notification. Another mention. Another clip spreading across the internet. Steve ignored it, instead closing his eyes and doing something he hadn't done in years, praying without performance, without eloquence, without certainty. "Lord," he whispered, voice cracking, "I don't have pretty words right now. Just help me make this right." The backstage corridor felt miles long as Steve Harvey made his way back toward the stage. Production assistants flattened themselves against the wall as he passed, their expressions a mixture of concern and curiosity. The muffled sound of applause filtered through from the main theater, the musical act finishing their performance, buying Steve precious minutes to prepare himself. Maya intercepted him before he reached the stage wings. Her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest, headset still buzzing with activity. "You okay?" she asked, her eyes scanning his face for signs of further breakdown. Steve adjusted his jacket, the familiar ritual helping to steady his nerves. "No," he admitted, his honesty surprising them both. "But the show goes on, right?" Maya nodded, relief evident in her posture. "The network wants to know if you're coming back out there, or if they need to find a replacement host." "Tell them I'm finishing what I started," Steve replied, straightening his tie with hands that still trembled slightly. "What's next in the program?" "The Street Jude's tribute. Then the donation tally. Then your closing remarks." Maya hesitated. "We can cut the closing if you—" "No," Steve interrupted firmly. "I need to address what happened. I owe that to everyone watching." Maya studied him for a moment, then nodded. "The teleprompter has the standard script for the tribute intro. After that, you're on your own." "I'm used to that," Steve replied with a ghost of his usual smile. From the stage, the musical director's voice announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back your host for the evening, Mr. Steve Harvey." Maya squeezed his arm once. "Remember why we're here? The children." Steve nodded, took a deep breath, and walked onto the stage. The applause that greeted him was polite but reserved, nothing like the enthusiastic reception he'd received at the show's opening. The audience's energy had shifted, no longer simply entertainment consumers. They were now witnesses to a public fall, uncertain whether to embrace or reject the man before them. Steve approached the microphone, forcing himself to stand tall despite the weight of hundreds of evaluating stares. "Thank you," he said simply, the customary phrase buying him precious seconds to gather his thoughts. The teleprompter glowed with the prepared introduction for the Street Jude segment. But Steve found himself unable to return to business as usual without acknowledging what had occurred. "Before we continue with our program," he began, his voice steady but stripped of its usual performer's polish, "I feel I need to address what happened earlier this evening." A ripple moved through the audience. Phones rose higher, cameras focusing. "Many of you witnessed something I'm deeply ashamed of. A moment where I let anger overcome principle, where I responded to words with a physical action that violated everything I claim to stand for." Steve paused, swallowing hard. "There is no excuse for putting my hands on another person, no matter what was said. Chuck Norris came here tonight as our guest, and I failed to show him the respect he deserved, not just as a legend, but as a fellow human being." The theater was utterly silent, the audience collectively holding its breath. "I've spent decades talking about faith, about grace, about how God changes a man from the inside out." Steve's voice grew quieter, forcing the audience to lean forward to catch his words. "Tonight, I showed you that sometimes that change is still a work in progress. that sometimes the old man wins a round over the new creation. In the front row, Reverend Cole nodded slowly, encouraging. To Chuck, who has already left the building, I offer my deepest and most sincere apology. To all of you watching, I ask not for your forgiveness, but for your understanding that a man's worst moment doesn't have to be his defining moment. Steve straightened his shoulders. Now, the important work we came here to do continues. Because regardless of my personal failings, there are children who need our help tonight. He turned toward the screens behind him, as they illuminated with images of children in hospital beds, their brave smiles contrasting with the medical equipment surrounding them. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you now to open your hearts, and yes, your wallets, as we share the inspiring stories of the real heroes we're here to support, the children and families of St. Jude's Children's Hospital. As the tribute video began to play, Steve stepped to the side of the stage, standing in respectful silence as the children's stories filled the massive screens. The audience's attention shifted from his personal drama to the powerful images before them, young faces showing courage beyond their years. Parents speaking of hope in the darkest moments, doctors explaining treatments made possible through charitable giving. Maya appeared beside him, keeping her voice low. That was good, Steve? Honest. He nodded, not trusting himself to speak again yet. His eyes fixed on the screens where a 7-year-old girl described her battle with leukemia with matter-of-fact bravery. The donation numbers are still climbing. Maya continued. What happened with Chuck hasn't affected the fundraising. If anything, she hesitated. If anything, what? Steve prompted. Donations have actually spiked in the last half hour. We're trending toward 14 million, 2 million over our goal. Steve closed his eyes briefly, conflicting emotions washing over him. Relief that the charity wouldn't suffer for his actions. Shame that his public failing might be driving attention and therefore donations. Gratitude that something positive could emerge from the wreckage of the evening. The tribute video concluded with a montage of children ringing ceremonial bells to mark the end of their treatments, their families celebrating beside them. The audience applauded warmly, many wiping away tears. Steve returned to center stage as the screens transitioned to show the donation tally $13,457,982 and rising by the second. Look at that number, he said, genuine awe in his voice. Look at what we can accomplish when we come together for something bigger than ourselves. He gestured toward the steadily increasing figures. Every dollar represents hope. Every dollar represents a statement that these children matter, that their fights matter, that we stand with them even in their darkest hours. The audience applauded again, the earlier tension beginning to dissolve in the face of the evening's true purpose. I'd like to take this moment to thank everyone who has contributed tonight. Steve continued, finding his rhythm again. From our corporate sponsors to every individual who picked up their phone and gave what they could. He paused, then added with quiet sincerity, and a special thank you to Chuck Norris, whose generous personal donation of $1 million demonstrates a heart for these children that transcends any philosophical differences he and I may have. Murmurs of surprise and appreciation rippled through the great rend and ovation crowd. In the control booth, the program director nodded approvingly. It was a graceful acknowledgement, a first step toward repair. As the planned program drew to its conclusion, Steve found himself facing the final moments of the broadcast. Traditionally, this was when he would deliver an inspirational closing, tying the evening's theme together with humor and heart. The teleprompter remained blank. This part had always been left to Steve's improvisational brilliance. But tonight, standing before an audience that had witnessed his very public failing, the usual platitudes felt hollow. insufficient. As we come to the end of our evening together, he began slowly, I find myself in an unusual position. Typically, this is where I'd wrap everything up with some wisdom, some inspiration, some call to action delivered with polish and certainty. He paused, looking out over the sea of faces. But tonight, I stand before you humbled. Earlier, you saw me fail to live up to my own standards, my own proclaimed values. You saw faith without grace, strength without control, a contradiction that I'm still trying to reconcile within myself. The audience was utterly still, hanging on his every word. And yet, despite witnessing that contradiction, you continued to give. You continued to support these children. You demonstrated a compassion that transcended judgment. Steve gestured toward the donation total, which had now surpassed $14 million. Perhaps there's a lesson in that for all of us, for me especially. That our worst moments don't have to define us. That grace exists, even when we fail to extend it to others. That strength isn't about never falling, it's about how we rise afterward. His voice grew stronger, finding its familiar cadence. Tonight was supposed to be about different kinds of strength. And in the end, maybe it was just not in the way we planned. We saw the strength of conviction, the strength of principle, but most importantly, we saw the strength of compassion, the kind that looks past human, failing to see the larger purpose. Steve took a step forward, addressing the audience directly, intimately. I don't know what happens next. I don't know how this night will be remembered, or what consequences will follow. But I do know this. $14 million is going to change lives. $14 million is going to give children a fighting chance. And if my public failing somehow contributed to that total, then perhaps some good can come even from my worst moment. He drew a deep breath. Thank you for your generosity. Thank you for your compassion. And thank you for reminding me that none of us, not even those who stand on stages and speak of faith, are beyond the need for grace. As the applause rose around him, Steve felt a curious lightness, not the euphoria of a successful performance, but something quieter and more profound. The mask had cracked, the perfect image shattered, and in that breaking, something authentic had emerged. The stage lights dimmed, signaling the broadcast's end. Steve nodded once to the audience, a simple acknowledgement rather than his usual theatrical bow, then turned and walked off stage. Maya was waiting in the wings, her expression a mixture of professional assessment and personal concern. How bad is it out there? Steve asked quietly as they moved away from the stage. She glanced down at her phone. It's mixed. Some are calling for your head, saying you've revealed your true character. Others are defending you, pointing out that everyone has a breaking point. She scrolled further. The religious discussions are getting heated both sides, using what happened to validate their positions. Steve nodded wearily. And the network? Emergency meetings happening right now. Maya admitted. Your contract has a morality clause, Steve. They're discussing options. The reality of potential professional consequences settled over him like a heavy cloak. 30 years of building a career, a brand, a reputation potentially undone in 30 seconds of lost control. I need to speak with Chuck, Steve said. Privately. Not through publicists or lawyers. Do we have any way to reach him directly? Maya hesitated. His manager says he's not taking calls right now, but... She lowered her voice. I have his personal cell. He gave it to me last year when we were trying to book him for that veteran special. Would you text him for me? Ask if he'd be willing to meet. Somewhere private, away from cameras. She nodded. I'll try. No promises. As they reached the dressing room area, Reverend Cole approached. His expression somber, but kind. You spoke from the heart out there, son. It was good. Steve sighed heavily. Too little. Too late, maybe. That's not for you to decide, the Reverend replied. You've taken the first step. Now comes the harder work. Salvaging my career? Steve asked with a bitter edge. Reverend Cole shook his head. Reconciling your faith with your humanity, understanding that the very conviction that makes you strong can become a weapon when pride attaches to it. He placed a hand on Steve's shoulder. You defended God tonight, Steve. But ask yourself, does the Creator of the universe need defending? Or did you react because Chuck's words threatened not God, but your identity as God's defender? The question hit Steve with unexpected force, exposing layers of motivation he hadn't been ready to examine. Before he could respond, Maya's phone buzzed in her hand. It's Chuck, she said, surprised. He's willing to meet. Tomorrow morning, 8 a.m., at his ranch outside the city. Tell him I'll be there. Steve replied immediately. As Maya typed the response, Steve turned back to Reverend Cole. Will you come with me? I could use your wisdom. The older man shook his head slowly. This is between you and Chuck. Some conversations need to happen man to man, without mediators or witnesses. He squeezed Steve's shoulder. But I'll be praying for you both. For healing. For understanding. And for the humility to see past your differences to the common ground beneath. Steve nodded. Grateful, yet apprehensive. Tomorrow would bring a reckoning more private but no less significant than tonight's public one. As exhaustion from the emotional ordeal washed over him, he found himself clinging to a single, surprising truth. Beneath the shame and regret, he felt more authentic than he had in years. The perfect image had been shattered, but the man beneath remained. Flawed, struggling, human, and perhaps, for the first time in decades, truly seen. Morning light bathed Chuck Norris's ranch as Steve Harvey's SUV approached the sprawling main house. The property stretched for hundreds of acres, a sanctuary built from decades of success in Hollywood and martial arts. Steve hadn't slept. His night consumed by reading reactions to the incident and fielding urgent calls. His social media had exploded. Morning shows were dissecting the confrontation on repeat, and network executives were deliberating his future. "We're here, sir," his driver announced as they pulled up to the tasteful combination of rustic and modern architecture. As Steve approached the entrance, the door opened before he could knock. Chuck stood there in simple black pants and a gray t-shirt that belied his 77 years. "Steve," he acknowledged with a slight nod. "Chuck," Steve replied. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." Chuck led him through the house to a back patio overlooking pristine hills. A table had been set with coffee and water. They sat across from each other. The setting deliberately neutral. No one had the higher ground. For a moment, neither spoke. Birds called from nearby trees. A gentle breeze stirred the air. "I've rehearsed what to say 100 times," Steve finally began. "But none of it seems adequate." Chuck regarded him steadily, expression revealing nothing. "What happened was inexcusable," Steve continued. "I reacted out of anger, out of pride, out of a place that contradicts everything I claim to believe. And for that, I am deeply sorry." Chuck studied Steve with the measured gaze of someone who had spent a lifetime reading opponents. "Why did you push me, Steve?" he finally asked. His tone neither accusatory nor angry, simply curious. The directness caught Steve off guard. He'd expected recriminations or legal threats. "Because I felt attacked," he admitted. "Not physically, of course. But when you spoke about Jesus, about faith being a crutch, it felt like an attack on the very foundation of who I am." Chuck nodded slightly. "And your response was to physically attack me in return?" "Yes," Steve acknowledged. The single syllable, heavy with regret. I let emotion override reason. I let pride override principle. Pride, Chuck repeated thoughtfully. In all my years of martial arts training, the most dangerous opponent was never the strongest or fastest. It was always the one with the most pride. He took a sip of coffee. Pride blinds. Pride deceives. Pride tells you that you're defending something noble when you're really just defending your ego. The observation struck uncomfortably close to home. Steve shifted in his seat. You think that's what happened? That I was defending my ego, not my faith? I think there's often very little distance between the two. Especially for public figures like us, whose identities become intertwined with what we represent. Steve considered this. Maybe I've spent so many years being Steve Harvey, man of faith, that I can't separate the message from the messenger anymore. A hint of softening crossed Chuck's face. That's a problem we share. Though from different angles. I've spent decades being Chuck Norris, unbeatable warrior. Our public personas become prisons of expectation. The observation created an unexpected bridge between them, a moment of shared understanding. For what it's worth, Steve said, I still believe everything I said about faith. But I was wrong to react with anger when you challenged that belief. And I was definitely wrong to put my hands on you. Chuck nodded. I appreciate that. He paused, then added, and I could have expressed my perspective with more sensitivity. I wasn't trying to attack your faith. I was speaking my truth, as I always have. I thought you shared my specific beliefs, Steve ventured, given your past interviews mentioning God. Faith and religion are complex, Chuck explained. My spiritual journey has taken me through many traditions. What I've found valuable in all of them is the emphasis on inner discipline and accountability. What I reject is dependency, the idea that we need external salvation rather than internal transformation. Rather than feeling defensive, Steve found himself genuinely curious. Why can't it be both? Why can't God empower that internal transformation? Perhaps he does, Chuck conceded, but in my experience, people often use faith as a substitute for action. Prayer as a replacement for discipline. They credit God for successes they worked for and blame the devil for failures they created. Steve listened, truly hearing the perspective that had triggered his anger. You've studied martial arts your entire life, he said. Would you say you mastered them on your own, through pure self-reliance? Chuck raised an eyebrow. No. I had teachers, mentors. So you acknowledge that some wisdom came from outside yourself? A slight smile touched Chuck's lips. Touché. Yes. Of course. But those teachers were human. Tangible. They showed techniques I could see, principles I could test. And for people of faith, God functions similarly as the ultimate teacher. The wisdom may come through prayer rather than physical demonstration, but the principle isn't so different. Chuck considered this. Though I would argue, the feedback mechanisms are quite different. In martial arts, you know immediately if a technique works. In faith, you have to trust without immediate verification. Steve finished. They had found a rhythm now, a respectful exchange where disagreement didn't equal disrespect. This is the conversation we should have had on stage, Chuck observed. Steve laughed softly. Instead of me shoving you, yeah, the ratings would have been lower, but the content better. The shared humor shifted something between them, not erasing what had happened, but creating space for something new. What happens now, Steve? For your career? Steve sighed heavily. I don't know. The network's reviewing my contracts. Some sponsors are already backing away. 30 years of building a reputation, potentially undone in 30 seconds. "Do you want me to make a public statement?" Chuck offered. "Something about accepting your apology?" The offer touched Steve deeply. "That's incredibly generous, Chuck. But this is my mess to clean up. My actions, my consequences." Chuck nodded, respect crossing his features. "Accountability. That's something we can both agree has value. Speaking of which, did you really donate $1 million to the Children's Hospital after what happened?" "I did," Chuck confirmed. "The children had nothing to do with our disagreement. They shouldn't suffer because two grown men couldn't communicate effectively." The simple statement highlighted what Steve was beginning to see, that beneath their different frameworks, there existed core values they both honored. They talked for another hour, discovering unexpected points of connection. Both had grown up in poverty. Both had failed in early careers before finding success. Both valued discipline and integrity, despite expressing those values differently. As Steve prepared to leave, Chuck walked him to the door. "What will you tell the press about our meeting?" he asked. "The truth. That we had a long, honest conversation. That you showed me more grace than I deserved. That two men with different perspectives found common ground through listening rather than defending. Good luck, Steve. Whatever rebuilding you need to do, remember that the strongest structures often rise from the rubble of what seemed unbreakable." As Steve returned to his waiting car, he felt a curious lightness, despite the uncertainty ahead. The perfect image was gone. The flawless reputation shattered. But in its place was something potentially more valuable: authenticity, humility, and the freedom that comes from being seen at your worst and still accepted. The network conference room felt oppressively formal, all gleaming surfaces and ergonomic chairs. Steve sat alone on one side of the table, facing a row of executives, lawyers, and PR specialists on the other, a power dynamic established before a single word was spoken. Lawrence Edwards, the network's silver-haired CEO, sat directly opposite Steve, flanked by the head of programming and chief legal counsel. His expression was practiced neutrality. "Steve," he began, folding his hands on the polished surface, "I think we all understand why we're here today." Steve nodded but remained silent, following his lawyer's advice to listen more than speak. "The incident has created a significant situation for all parties involved," Edwards continued, sliding a document folder across the table. "We have several options before us. None ideal, but all necessary given the circumstances." Inside were 3 documents: immediate termination with cause, a negotiated exit with non-disclosure agreements, or a conditional return with substantial penalties and restrictions. "Before we discuss these," Steve said, his voice steady, "I'd like to know where the network stands beyond the legal perspective. Lawrence, you and I have worked together for 15 years. What's your honest assessment?" Edwards shifted uncomfortably at the personal appeal. "Professionally speaking, the incident has created significant challenges. Advertisers are concerned about association with unpredictable behavior. Social media metrics show negative reactions outweighing positive approximately 3 to 1. And, personally speaking?" Steve pressed. Edwards removed his glasses with a sigh. "Personally, Steve, I was shocked. I've known you to be a consummate professional, a man who consistently emphasized dignity and self-control. To see you react physically, on our platform, during a charity broadcast." He shook his head. "It contradicted everything I thought I knew about Steve Harvey." "That's fair," Steve acknowledged. "And I understand the position it's put the network in." "Do you?" Daniel, the younger head of programming, interjected. "We've got sponsors pulling millions in advertising, social media on fire with clips of our flagship host shoving a 77-year-old man on live television, and religious groups on both sides using the incident to push their agendas." He tapped the documents sharply. These aren't just options, Mr. Harvey. They're lifeboats from a sinking ship. Steve suppressed a defensive reaction. I understand the commercial impact. I also know that Chuck Norris and I have reached an understanding. He's not pursuing legal action. That's helpful but insufficient, the legal counsel noted dryly. The issue isn't just potential litigation from Mr. Norris. It's the breach of contract regarding public conduct. What about the conditional return? Steve asked, tapping the final document. That would require several commitments, Edwards explained. A public apology to everyone involved. Professional counseling for anger management. A 3-month probation with heightened content review. And a 30% reduction in compensation to offset advertising losses. Steve recognized they weren't offering redemption so much as penance public, prolonged, and profitable for them. He considered his options carefully. I have a different proposal, he said finally. Edwards raised an eyebrow. We're listening. I take a 60-day leave of absence. Unpaid. During that time, I do the necessary personal and professional work. The anger management counseling, yes, but also a series of conversations, public ones, about faith, philosophy, and our increasingly divided world. What kind of conversations? Edwards asked, interest flickering across his face. Real ones. Not scripted, not performed. Conversations where people with fundamentally different worldviews actually listen to each other. Starting with Chuck, Norris, and me. Daniel scoffed. You think viewers want philosophy lessons from the guy they just watched lose control on national television? I think what happened resonated because it reflects a larger truth about our culture. Steve countered evenly. We talk at each other, not with each other. We defend positions rather than exploring ideas. When challenged, we react with emotion rather than engagement. He leaned forward. What if instead of hiding from what happened, we use it as a starting point for something meaningful? Something that acknowledges human complexity instead of pretending it doesn't exist? The executives exchanged skeptical glances, but Edwards looked thoughtful. What exactly are you proposing? A 6-episode special series called Strength and Faith. Uncommon Conversations. Each episode brings together people with fundamentally different worldviews. Not for debate, not for conflict, but for genuine dialogue. And you would host these conversations? Edwards asked skeptically. After demonstrating such a volatile reaction to opposing viewpoints? That's precisely why it needs to be me. Because I failed publicly, and now I have the opportunity to grow publicly. Steve leaned forward. The first episode would feature Chuck and me, revisiting our confrontation, exploring what triggered it, and modeling what real reconciliation looks like. Daniel shook his head. Too risky. Too philosophical. Our viewers want entertainment, not a therapy session. Your viewers are human beings, navigating a world that's increasingly divided, Steve countered quietly. What happened between Chuck and me? That's happening every day on social media, in politics, in families. People reducing others to the beliefs they hold, then attacking those beliefs instead of understanding the person behind them. Edwards tapped his pen thoughtfully. There's something there. The ratings spike during your confrontation suggests viewers are drawn to authentic moments, even uncomfortable ones. Especially uncomfortable ones, Steve corrected, because they reflect reality. After further discussion, Edwards finally spoke. The probation terms remain non-negotiable, as does the counseling. But instead of a simple leave of absence, we could explore this series concept with strict oversight and the understanding that one misstep means immediate termination. Steve nodded. I accept those conditions. As Steve left the network offices, he texted Maya that he wasn't fired yet and was meeting with Reverend Cole next. The church sat quiet and dignified on a tree-lined street, its modest architecture reflecting the Reverend's preference for substance over spectacle. "You look tired, son," Reverend Cole observed as Steve took a seat in his book-lined study. Steve explained the network's decision, then added, "But I'm struggling with something deeper. All these years, I've presented myself as a man of unshakable faith. But when my faith was challenged, I didn't respond with grace or wisdom. I responded with pride and anger." "Yes, you did," Reverend Cole agreed simply. "So what does that say about my faith? Was it all just talk? Just a performance?" The Reverend considered the question carefully. "Do you remember Peter in the Garden of Gethsemane? He cut off the soldier's ear when they came to arrest Jesus." Steve nodded. "So I'm in good company in my failure." "That's not my point," the Reverend corrected. "My point is that genuine faith isn't about perfect performance. It's about honest transformation, a process that includes failures and moments when our humanity overwhelms our spirituality." He stood, moving to the bookshelves. "The problem isn't that you failed, Steve. The problem is that you and many others have presented faith as if it eliminates the possibility of failure, as if believing strongly enough creates some kind of spiritual force field against human frailty." The observation cut to the heart of Steve's discomfort. "I've been preaching a perfect faith I couldn't live up to." "We all have," Reverend Cole replied. "Faith doesn't eliminate our struggles. It gives them meaning. It doesn't prevent our failures. It redeems them." As Steve left the church, something had shifted within him, not a resolution, but a permission to sit honestly with his contradictions. The path forward remained uncertain, but for the first time, he could see possibility emerging from the wreckage of his perfect image. The studio lights felt different this time. Less glaring, less intimidating. Or perhaps it was Steve who had changed, approaching this moment with a humility that transformed his relationship to the spotlight. 6 weeks had passed since the incident that had threatened his career and shaken his identity. 6 weeks of soul-searching, counseling sessions, and conversations with both faith leaders and critics. 6 weeks of rebuilding not the perfect image he had once cultivated, but something more authentic. The set of strength and faith, uncommon conversations, was deliberately different. No flashy graphics or elaborate staging. Just 2 comfortable chairs positioned at a slight angle, creating an intimate space for genuine conversation rather than performance. 5 minutes, Steve, Maya said, approaching with clipboard in hand. "Chuck just arrived." Steve nodded, adjusting his simple navy tie. "How is he?" "Calm," Maya replied with a slight smile. "But then, when isn't he? The network executives are watching from the control room," she added. "Edwards flew in specifically for this." "Let them watch," Steve replied, surprisingly at peace with the scrutiny. "This isn't about saving my show or pleasing the network. It's about creating something honest." There was no audience present, a deliberate choice to ensure the conversation remained genuine rather than performative. Just cameras, a minimal crew, and the weight of expectations. Chuck appeared from the opposite side, moving with his characteristic deliberate grace. At 77, he remained commanding, posture straight, gaze direct, every movement controlled. They met at center stage, the memory of their confrontation hanging between them. The red light on the camera illuminated. Maya gave a silent countdown. "Good evening," Steve began, his voice stripped of its usual polish. "My name is Steve Harvey. And 6 weeks ago, I lost control on national television. During a charity event, I responded to words with physical aggression. I pushed a man I respected because he challenged beliefs I hold dear. The camera pulled back, revealing Chuck seated across from him. That man was Chuck Norris, martial arts legend, actor, and cultural icon. And rather than condemning my actions, he agreed to meet with me privately, to have an honest conversation about what happened and why. Steve turned slightly toward Chuck. That conversation changed something in me. It opened doors to understanding that I had kept firmly closed through years of certainty. And it made me wonder what might happen if more of us were willing to truly listen to perspectives that challenge our own. He faced the camera again. That's the purpose of this series. Not to debate, not to convince, but to explore what happens when we approach differences with curiosity instead of defensiveness. Steve turned to Chuck. I'd like to start with the obvious question. When I pushed you that night, what went through your mind? Surprise. Primarily, Chuck answered with characteristic directness. Not at the disagreement I expected that when I expressed my views on faith, but at the physical response. You weren't afraid? Angry? No. Chuck replied simply. Those reactions require losing control of one's emotional state. My training has centered on maintaining that control, regardless of external circumstances. That's a stark difference in our approaches, Steve acknowledged, because in that moment, I lost all control. When you spoke about Jesus, about faith being something to outgrow, something in me snapped. Why do you think that happened? I think, Chuck began carefully, that you perceived my challenge to religious faith as a personal attack rather than a philosophical position. For you, faith isn't just a belief system, it's your core identity. Steve nodded. That's accurate. But here's what I've been reflecting on. Why was my faith so fragile that words could threaten it? If I truly believe what I claim to believe, why did I need to defend it with physical force? Their conversation continued, examining faith, strength, pride, and humility. Throughout, there was a quality rarely seen on television, not forced politeness, but genuine respect between two people, honestly engaging with different perspectives. As they neared the end, Steve turned toward the camera. We began by looking back at a moment of conflict, a moment when I allowed anger to override principle. It wasn't my finest hour, but sometimes our worst moments create opportunities for growth that our best moments never could. He leaned forward, expression earnest. What I've learned is that true strength isn't found in certainty that never questions or conviction that never doubts. It's found in the courage to examine our beliefs honestly, to acknowledge our limitations humbly, and to engage with difference curiously rather than defensively. After the recording ended, network executive Lawrence Edwards approached, his expression thoughtful. That wasn't what I expected, he admitted. It was compelling, uncomfortable in places certainly, challenging, but compelling in a way I didn't anticipate. The series continues. As Steve left the studio that evening, he felt a sense of peace despite the uncertain path ahead. The perfect image had been shattered, but in its place stood something far more valuable. A man willing to face his flaws, embrace his complexity, and use his platform not to proclaim certainty, but to create space for honest exploration. Not a neat conclusion, not a problem solved, but a path unfolding with all its challenges and opportunities for growth. The journey continues. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.